Hello and welcome to a landmark edition of The Bunker, your morning shot of news and politics for these past 5 years. I'm Andrew Harrison, welcoming you to our 1500th edition. For episode 1, way back on the 28th of January 2020, Ross Taylor, Ian Dunt and I were joined by Barack Obama's former Homeland Security Advisor Amy Pope. We talked about the Trump impeachment latest and what would happen if a bright young lawyer called Keir Starmer were to win the Labour leadership. Would his first big fight be with Boris Johnson or with continuity Corbynism? But time moves on. We went daily and we built up the team with new members like historian, author, screenwriter, and lately presenter of the Lucan Obsession on Radio 4, Alex von Tunzelmann. Hello, Alex.
Hello.
Does it feel like 1,500 episodes to you?
Yeah, just in the last week.
Yes, you are certainly cranking them out at the moment. Listeners, the existence of this pod is entirely down to people like you and Patreon backers like you. So for this special edition, we wanted to bring you a really special guest. Today, we're joined by a true heavy hitter of the Labour Party, somebody who led the party against possibly the most formidable enemy it's ever faced, Margaret Thatcher. In the mid-80s, he strained every muscle to drag Labour back from the unelectable wilderness and restore its credibility. He set it on the road to its historic victory in 1997. And he's just seen a similar cycle repeat itself, ending again in a Labour victory. He went on to be European Commissioner and Vice President of the European Commission. He'll tell you, and you'll listen. It's Neil Kinnock. How you doing?
The only person you could find who's 1,500 years old.
Absolutely. What was it like in the old days? Welcome. And we should tell the listeners, by the way, we're recording this on Friday the 7th of February because Neil is a very busy man, as you would imagine. So forgive us if we talk about a thing or two that's subsequently overtaken by events. But Neil, I wanted to just start by asking you, I mean, this is almost a kind of a repeat of the circumstances of the 1997 government. You know, you see a Labour government elected, winning a landslide after very long, dark years of infighting and introspection. And, a Labour government is always going to be portrayed as a disaster by the Tory press. But objectively, how do you think it's going so far? We're like 6 months in.
In the circumstances that it inherited, I think it's doing quite well. On election night, give some context, I made a comment about the government. I was delighted to see they were going to be elected, but they faced post-war conditions, even though we hadn't had a war, thank God. Anyway, somebody from The Economist heard me and asked me to do an online global essay saying why I'd come to this conclusion, which I did. And, the more you think about it, the more you recognize the dimensions of crises in economic underperformance and complete hollowing out of vital public services. They really do remind one, certainly redolent of destruction that had taken place over a wartime period. The difference is that obviously today's public don't have the cohesion in the community or the ready deference to rationing, to the regimentation of wartime. And I mean, I'm very glad that they haven't. We're a free people and we've had freedom for a very long time. But at the same time, it does mean that impatience is really high and rising because people want rapid improvement, even though and when they understand the constraints on accelerating the improvement, for instance, in public services. So, I mean, that's the real background, and that's what Keir and his colleagues have got to deal with. It ain't heaven.
Yeah. How do you think Starmer's doing personally as leader? Because, I mean, he didn't get an instant honeymoon period like Blair did. He's been under fire since day one. Even his biggest fans would say he's not the warmest and most kind of, he's not the most widescreen character. How do you think he's doing?
Well, he's not a politician. Right. And in some respects, that's very good news, especially in an era when politicians are able to crawl under a snake with a top hat on, in most people's opinion. Wrongly, in my view, but nevertheless, we know the stock of professional politicians is very, very low. But, of course, at the same time, it imposes disadvantages on Keir because politics is a very rough old trade, but it is a trade. And if it's possible to undertake the apprentice and journeyman stage and then get your city and guilds in being a politician, that's ideal. But I think in the end, it's an advantage for him to really be normal, to come straight off the top of the Clapham omnibus and be able to think, not as lots of politicians do think, but to think as an ordinary, aspiring guy with kids and obligations and paying his taxes. Now, he's made some slips in these 7 months. The stuff about his specs and his clothes. And there was something last week, I can't remember what it was, which showed personal follies which wouldn't be made by someone who is only a politician. Yeah. So even though they are downgrading Marx, in one sense, they're almost refreshing reminders of his innocence of being a politician.
On that substance, in January, Ipsos polled British voters on these 5 Starmer missions and found that more people think Labour's doing a bad job than a good job. Kickstart economic growth, take back our streets had bad job ratings of 43%, build an NHS fit for the future, 41%. The constant refrain is that Labour's messaging is bad. Do you think that's true, or is there an issue in the kind of coherence? Is it just a collection of policies rather than a story?
Well, I tell you, I'm thinking that it's possible that you would raise the issue of what the hell have they been doing for 7 months. I actually typed out a list, and I'm going to bore you for about 10 seconds in a moment. But it's almost impossible for the government to achieve popularity or even recognition for effort in the circumstances inherited. This isn't an excuse, it's a reality. Why do we know that? Because despite inadequate messaging, and I do underscore that, I don't think it's very good at all, people voted Labour last July, first of all, because they weren't the Tories, and secondly, because nothing bloody worked. Now, that's not my phrase. You could hear that anywhere and everywhere from people of every background, every part of the United Kingdom, both genders, all ages. Nothing bloody works. Now, in those circumstances, I think what the government should have been saying from day one, we know why you voted Labour. It was to get rid of the Tories primarily because you were insulted with them and you were determined to use your vote to get rid of them. But you also voted Labour because nothing bloody worked. We will make it work, but as every adult in the country knows, it cannot be rapid and it will take not just time, but money. And money is very, very short, especially since we have given you an undertaking. We're not going to impose additional taxation on working people. Now, in the circumstances, I think that message, which was direct, honest, using the phrase the people had invented themselves, would have had much greater resonance than all the stuff about black holes. I've said to economist chums of mine, tell me about the black holes. And either they go into jargon, which is impenetrable, and they admit that, or they say, I don't know, have another drink.
But you've got, come on then, this is going to be useful to our listeners.
Here we go.
Years ago, when people used to say, what did Tony Blair ever do for us? I had a little thing on my computer, I could cut and paste and put the list together. That's what they did.
Well, what I used to say then, because they used to say to me, including, of course, in Labour Party meetings.
Yeah.
And, well, they're, 2 years in, 3 years in. Well, I mean, what are they doing? And I would say, well, I tell you what, when did you last see a newspaper feature with a stretcher in a hospital corridor? When did you last see a picture in a newspaper of a bucket catching raindrops coming through the roof of a school? And they'd scratch their heads, and I'd say, it's a couple of years now, isn't it? And you can bet on the fact that our ever-vigilant British press, dispassionate and objective as it is, would have registered those photographs. if they could take them, but they can't because of what Labour has been doing. Now, in the same spirit, in this last 7 months, against the background that we've been describing, the pay deals for teachers, health workers and rail workers have been resolved. There's been an increase in the minimum wage, or there's about to be, which is a substantial and absolutely justifiable rise. We've had the best budget settlement for Wales and Scotland and local government in England since 2010. It's not enough, but it's a start. Wages are rising, inflation is falling, and scrapping the VAT loophole for private schools is a step in the right direction, especially when the saved resources are going to be allocated to the schooling of the other 93%. And then we've got a flock of bills coming through Parliament. They include the renationalisation of Rail Bill, the Employment Rights Bill, the Greater British Energy Bill, which is vital, the House of Lords Hereditary Peers Abolition Bill, hooray, Tobacco and Vapes Bill, the Armed Forces Commissioner Bill, the Renters Reform Bill. Very practical issues. Some of them a matter of principle, like the abolition of hereditary peers. Some of them absolutely bread and butter, and they're going through their legislative stages.
Yes, and yet we will still have people out there going, yeah, but what are they doing for us? What are they doing for us?
Yes, quite.
So, like our colleague Steve Richards on the Rock and Roll Politics podcast, and
Love him.
Steve, top
Great
dude.
pal of mine.
Yeah, top chap. He always says that leaders are teachers.
Yes,
right? Leaders
I agree.
will bring you along. Starmer, actually, ironically, has a teacher-like demeanour. A lot of my mates say he always looks like he's about to say to you, I expected it from the rest of them, but I'm disappointed in you.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? He's got
that's exactly it.
that kind of fella.
God, have I heard that a few times.
Exactly. And you were very much a kind of teacher stroke storyteller, first Kinnock in 1,000 generations, that kind of stuff. Starmer does have a compelling personal story, and as you just described there's a policy story.
Yeah.
It's not being told as a story. Do you think this is something Labour are kind of leaving on the table? They're maybe letting others write their story for them?
Well, there was a story last week about Keir, when he first became leader, getting a voice coach from the National Theatre, which when I lost my voice, because I'd done 90-odd meetings in 3 weeks in the 83 election, and Cicely Berry, the chief voice coach of the National Theatre, who was a great Labour supporter, actually came for a chat and then stayed for a drink. And I met her 3 times in her official capacity. We never actually talked about improving my voice, but we did talk a lot about Shakespeare. I learned a lot from her, and we had a couple of drinks, and it was very good. Now, I hope Keir's time was equally profitably employed. But rather than a voice coach, if he'd had a storytelling coach, exactly as you say, that might have helped. Now, what Keir does is gather evidence and then use the evidence to press prosecution. And that's what he does. That's his trade. And he does it brilliantly, or he wouldn't have got to the top of the profession. He should do that more, because it sounds very much like storytelling. And you're absolutely right. Steve's right to say leaders in politics, in the military, in industry, in trade unions, in broadcasting, whatever, must be storytellers. And Keir's got a story to tell. And this is why I am less than happy with our communications effort, because if he's not doing it, they should do it. But in addition, the Commons people should be saying to him, hey, look, boss, this is the way that we want to set the story out. Will you help us? That's the least they should be doing.
Yeah. In the absence of that story, there is a kind of sense that, Labour just brings you bad news in dribs and drabs, whether it's, Rachel Reeves with the benefit efficiencies or the winter fuel cuts or keeping the Tory disability benefit cuts, whether it's Wes Streeting saying the NHS is going back to basics for efficiencies. It seems like rather than delivering a coherent whole, with the bad bits and the good bits. It's like every few weeks that there's another kind of, and it's making the party become identified as the party that brings you the bad news. How long does it have before, how long does it have to start delivering things that people notice? Because what you described there is all true, but they're not really noticing it yet. How before it becomes a serious problem?
I don't think it can begin to tell the very positive story and point to accomplishments until about 18 months in.
Right.
And that's a guess. It could be 2 years, it could be 15 months. So I'm not offering a forecast. I'm simply saying that because so many of the changes they're seeking to secure and pursuing will take time to show, whether it's in terms of improvements in public services or in terms of the enactment of legislation which will make a difference to opportunity and security, the two fundamentals of the duty that democratic governments have. So it's going to be 18 months in, and even then, and for some times after, there's not going to be anything, in my view, in the way of giveaways.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right that in order to motivate people, in order even to get people to exercise some patience, you must discover and publicize the pluses, the good things, the promising outcomes, not as propaganda, but simply to say to people with a bit more effort, we can achieve this, that, and the other. I mean, in the post-war years, after 1945, the economy wrecked, widespread, obvious destruction, physical destruction of housing, of facilities, of infrastructure due to the Blitzkrieg and underinvestment for years before the war. But because people knew the National Health Service was coming, that universal free secondary education up to the age of 15 had been introduced, that industries had been nationalized in order to secure investment, which was desperately necessary, that national insurance was commencing in order to afford civilized levels of old age pension. They knew that was coming. So when it did arrive, even on the first day, when obviously nothing physically, materially had changed, spirits were lifted and they were willing to exercise that bit more patience. Now, it is essential that the government, a democratic government, communicates the absolutely plausible, positive news, not propaganda. People will reject that rightly, but positive news that makes the continuing effort, the continuing payment, the continuing collective subscription worth doing.
You've already mentioned that, hinted the point that Labour has come into office with quite serious self-imposed spending constraints.
Yes.
And before the election, you said Labour were right not to offer to scrap the two-child benefit cap because it put them at risk of breaking election promises. Is there a moment after a landslide when you can revise your promises, or should?
Maybe there would have been times in the past. God knows the Tories did it often enough. I mean, I just give one illustrative example, not for the purposes of bashing, but because you're a historian, okay? 1979, solemn promise, no increase in taxation. Within weeks, the Geoffrey Howe budget increased VAT by 95%. It went up from 9% to 10% to 18%. I mean, it was gigantic. And they suffered some consequences, not just because of that, but for other reasons. So they were, for a few years, desperately unpopular. But then paying extra VAT became part of the warp and weft, totally normal. So they've, 59, you may remember it. I remember it because
like it was yesterday.
I'm so old, I was campaigning. They campaigned again in 1959 on no increases in taxation. So 3 weeks after they were elected, they put national insurance up by threepence as the rate. So it went up, I think, at that stage from 4p to on the money that was liable for payment of national insurance. It had a ceiling then, I think, of about 17,000 a year, which was unimaginable riches, by the way. But they put it up, nearly doubled it, and they got away with it. Now, a Labour government that said it wasn't going to increase taxes on working people and then stood in its head within weeks or months of the election would never be forgiven. Why? Not just because it would be under attack by the Tories, feeble as they are now, they would still attack, but much more consistently, much more effectively, much more piercingly by a whole swathe of the press, and then unavoidably the echo chamber of broadcast news and comment. So they would get hammered to the point where they possibly wouldn't be able to recover reputation. So they will not do that. They will have to find ways of increasing revenues otherwise, and they will do that. But nevertheless, I don't think that they will ever sabotage their own promise on levels of taxation. One of the reasons being, of course, because the amount of our GDP relating to taxation is higher than it has been in peacetime at any time ever.
And that comes back to, obviously, kind of another word that we're hearing constantly out of this government is growth. Growth and productivity, two British problems that successive governments have grappled with, not always to great success. But on growth, the FT surveyed 600 leading economists and said that Britain's economic gloom is overdone. The outlook is robust compared to the EU, spelled out a lot of positives on infrastructure and investment, and concluded Britain's national negative mood seems excessive.
Yes.
So, OK, the news isn't actually that terrible, but how does Labour get around that drumbeat of negativity that exists anyway?
It's going to be difficult, especially when yesterday, that's right, the Bank of England said that their growth forecast over the next 12 months was being reduced from 1.5%, which isn't bursting with health, to 0.75%. Now, I think that probably the Bank of England is underestimating, because I think that the improvement in public sector investment will sustain a slightly higher level of growth. But that's a guess on my part, and it might well be wrong. A year ago, almost exactly a year ago, Rachel Reeves, highly intelligent woman with a very clear understanding of modern economics, gave the Mays Lecture, which is a task of all chancellors. In the Mays Lecture, amongst other things, she cast aside the shibboleth that public sector investment crowded out private sector investment, which is absolute rubbish. In fact, it's the opposite of the truth, obviously, as long as the level of public investment is reasonable, not absolutely excessive with money being splashed everywhere, which never happens anyway. But the reality is public sector investment magnetizes private sector investment, and other economies around the world demonstrate that year after year after year. In this country, because particularly for the last 40-odd years, we've been obsessed by the idea that if borrowing takes place, it should only be investment, which I think is a correct approach, but also that we should so constrain that public investment as to abandon it altogether if the economy and the public purse is under pressure. That's entirely the opposite of what should be done. And the years of austerity of Osborne and Cameron demonstrated that conclusively. And we're still paying with low growth now for the so-called years of austerity and devastating underinvestment. Now, in these circumstances, what I hope Rachel will do is to make it very, very clear, in line with the view that she expressed with huge intelligence and insight, in my view, in the Mays lecture last year, and really consistently pursue a path of increased public sector investment in order deliberately to attract higher inward private investment. And I'm sure that as we see infrastructure improvements, not just physical infrastructure, but intellectual infrastructure improvements, then private sector investment will increasingly come to our country. And that will be the great stimulus for sustained and sustainable growth and the opportunities and employment and advances in science, technology, pharmaceuticals, greening the environment that can come with that.
As we said, you were an EU commissioner. You were eventually vice president of the commission. Glynis was an MEP in Wales for 15 years.
She was the democratic one. I was the bureaucratic one. As she never ceased to remind me.
But on the question of Europe, obviously, you were a massive Remainer. You're furious when the Brexit vote went through. And in the days when we were doing the Remainiacs podcast, we'd always go, what's Kinnock said this week? How do you feel about Labour's intransigence now on the single market, the customs union? It's like, it's a clear route to the growth that we need. It's a political nightmare, an economic dream. What's your take on their position? Is it wise?
I'm baffled. I'm absolutely baffled, and for two reasons, really. First of all, because staying out of the single market, the customs union, inflicts such disadvantage on our country. And the people know it. The tide of public opinion has been shifting for a long time, and it continues to shift, not in floods, but continually, as more and more people encounter the factual demonstrations of the disadvantage that we've inflicted on ourselves. So, first of all, being outside the single market is a terrible mistake. I understand why it was made. In most people's case who voted leave, it was in hope. They were immensely miserable. They were enduring great disadvantage, especially in those years of acute austerity, and they were promised real change, big difference, advances, sunlit upland. And they didn't vote because they were stupid. They voted because they were hopeful. Okay, they've been devastatingly let down by the lies that they were told then. But I understand why they wanted to accept that version. Okay, the second reason why I'm bewildered is I know damn well that there are Labour ministers who are earnestly working to establish that new relationship, which is vital, and to do it, if possible, without being part of the single market and the rules that go with that and so on, even though you can't have a competitive free market without rules. Otherwise, it's total, complete chaos. So you've got to have rules in any case. But I know they've been establishing relationships, generating trust, getting respect, getting understanding. And they've been doing that for 2.5 years, not just since the election. And nothing material appears to be coming out of it. So I'm waiting for the day when we start to see us maybe initiating a really new relationship on the basis of defense and security, and then rapidly building further understanding and agreement, negotiated agreement, in other spheres that are economic, technical, to do with visas for particular kinds of businesses, for students, for school kids, even biometric passports, and a variety of other developments, which individually are steps, collectively, cumulatively, could over a very few years be a big stride towards re-establishing what I call a normal relationship with our nearest neighbours and by far our biggest market.
You basically rebuild it as if with Lego,
Yes,
bit by
that's
bit,
right.
because
Yes.
you don't want to frighten away the voters who came to Labour in the last election, but who maybe loaned their vote to Labour or voted without enthusiasm. My question is, you know, is the party frightened of making a big move that would mean you don't have to take the Lego approach because it's worried about losing the votes of people who essentially will never be enthusiastic about voting for them and might end up losing core votes? Do you see what I mean?
I think, do you know what I think the greater danger is now? Is not so much losing votes because people who voted for us had voted leave and have not shifted their position. There are some people who never will, but they're not going to vote for us in any case. And those who did vote for us could, in any case, on the basis of some encounters I've had, and I wouldn't pretend that they're scientific analysis, voted for us again in the hope that what they experience as pretty miserable existence would change because they're a Labour government that wasn't afraid to change the relationship with Europe. But I think now, for Labour, the real danger politically is that the Faragists, Reform, get an easier path to catching up and even winning some seats because of the slippage of votes from Labour to Liberals, Greens, Nationalists, or abstention, simply because people do not agree with the reserved and small c conservative and cautious conduct of the Labour government. Now, I hope that's not the case. Of course, I hope that's not the case. But there's a great danger now for Labour in a very fluid democracy where people have uprooted traditional loyalties on a huge scale, that people do drift off or simply withhold votes at all. And that will make the job of a minor party that can get 24, 25% of the votes in a reduced turnout and catch us in seats in much greater numbers than they did in July last year.
So you lead in the Labour Party in the 80s and early 90s when the right were absolutely in the ascendant. And in fact, certainly when I was a teenager, it looked like Margaret Thatcher would be in power forever. Your landscape was Margaret Thatcher here and Reagan in the United States, and the left and social democracy just felt completely marginalised. We're not back in the same situation, but we do have a huge kind of movement to the right around the world. Are there, sometimes it feels like the role of the Labour Party is to be the perpetual underdog, even when you're the government. How do you keep the kind of flame of hope alive, as it were? When you open the papers in the morning and it's all grim, what can you remember from your time leading Labour, and how you keep the flame alive?
Well, it's vital to have conviction that isn't fanatical, but is realistic and related entirely to the realities that people live with. It also means, of course, that you've got to understand that if your convictions are sincere and deep enough, you are willing to compromise. The only people who are afraid of compromising are people with very shallow convictions, because they are afraid of being accused of betrayal of the true faith, which of course is nonsense. You can't even bring kids up on that basis. You've got to be pragmatic. You've got to be willing to sustain your convictions and seek to put them into effect by a process of gradualism and accumulation of improvement. Now, facing Reagan and Thatcher, let's put it like this. One of the main reasons that I stood to be leader of the Labour Party and invite my midlife crisis was because if the Labour Party had continued as it appeared to be in 1979 to 1983, increasingly influenced by what was thought of as Bennery or Bennism, more and more distant from the realities endured by the great majority of people, including working class people, of course, most of all, then social democracy, democratic socialism in Britain, would at best be marginalized. People didn't believe in it, wouldn't vote for it, and continual reduction in support was guaranteed. And so in order to try and stop that happening, I ran for the leadership, and as it happened, I won. And what I then had to do was to mobilize the people in the labour movement, in the trade unions, and in the constituencies that I knew shared my instincts and convictions. And of course, that was an uphill task. It took too damn long, largely because the commitment to policies, totally sincere, and at the time the commitment was made, for very good reasons, had become almost religious devotion. So I couldn't wave a wand or even secure a mass vote in conference. People had to be persuaded. That's what took so damn long. And you mentioned Steve Richards earlier. He's absolutely right in concluding, as I did long ago, that the reason I was defeated in 1992, a main reason, not the exclusive reason, was I'd just been there too bloody long. I was old hat. John Major, nice man, effective, pleasant, relatable, was relatively new, and nobody really knew much about John Major, and John Major won. Fine, okay, that's democracy. You have to take the rough with the rough. All right. But the thing about Margaret Thatcher was by the time she'd done 10 years, she'd been there too long, and people were realizing that she was inhaling the propaganda. She really did start to believe that she was so significant that she was above the normal levels of accountability and responsibility of democratic politicians. Now, I'm certain she never even articulated such a view to her mirror when she was putting on her lipstick, but that's how she was conducting herself, which is why the Tories got rid of her.
Because that relates very strongly to this point I was going to ask you about, this collapse of trust in politicians, the belief that they're all the same. Democracy can't function in that kind of environment, and especially in now an environment that, we're in the information age, but we're in the disinformation age as well going on. Candidates who lie and cheat now seem to have an inbuilt advantage. How do we restore trust?
Well, first thing to observe is there's never been a time since we've had anything resembling democracy that politicians as a class, as a group, as a tribe, have been trusted by the electorate. And in some respects, of course, that's healthy. Put not thy faith in princes. And that's as old as the biblical history, and it's true in modern times. The degree to which politicians are now distrusted relates to, in truth, a gap between what they've either promised or appear to promise over decades and the gap between that and what they've actually achieved. On top of that, you've had a culture of disbelief. The cynicism about politicians doesn't only apply to politicians. There is a public disregard for commitment, for belief. And I'm not pointing fingers or making accusations or decrying people. That's just where we are in a meretricious world and a very superficial sort of mechanical and economic civilization, where many, many people know the price of lots of things and the value of nothing. And I'm not being cynical myself. I'm just observing realities. What politicians in those circumstances, indeed in any circumstances, in a democracy, have to do is to try to tell the truth all the time, including the truth that we are seeking to do the following, and it may not come off. Please, dear fellow adults, understand that we are elected human beings that are striving to make things better, not superhuman. We cannot invent financial resources that don't exist. We will try to apply our charges to generate revenues as fairly, as equitably as we can. Sometimes we will get it wrong. And some of the things we spend on will turn out to be dud in the very nature of things. But that's where we are. That's what we're trying to do. If you think you can do better, please join a democratic political party and demonstrate that. Don't just switch off, become apathetic, reject the arduous process of democracy, which involves you. And we will try to give you accountability. Please return to us your discernment, your factually advised judgment. We ask for nothing more than that, but it's a two-way traffic.
Thanks for joining us in the bunker. And thank you, Alex from Tunzelmann. We'll see you on the bunker soon.
See you there.